I sat in the Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio, the steady beeping of the monitor cutting through the silence like a cruel metronome, marking the rhythm of my son's fragile heart. The antiseptic smell of bleach and latex clung to the air, a sterile reminder of how close life and death hovered in this room. My hands gripped the tiny fingers of my 8-year-old boy, Ethan, as if by holding on tight enough I could anchor him here with me, away from the darkness that was pressing in. His skin felt too cool. His chest rose and fell under the weight of a machine that was breathing for him. The doctors had told me the truth I had dreaded for months. A life-saving procedure existed. It had a chance, not a promise, but a chance to give Ethan more years, maybe a lifetime. The cost was $80,000. A number that in the abstract might seem like just another figure in a ledger, but in this room it was the line between my son's smile and his grave. I had begged, I had pleaded, I had scraped every cent from tutoring extra hours after my teaching job. I had sold furniture, jewelry, even my car. I had launched a GoFundMe that strangers gave to out of kindness, but all I had managed was $12,000. It was not enough. So I turned where I believed family was supposed to stand up. I drove across Columbus to Upper Arlington to the pristine home of my mother Linda and my stepfather Richard. I can still hear the sound of the rain that night tapping against their polished windows while I sat on their leather couch, hands trembling, voice cracking. I laid it all out. Ethan's doctors. The bills, the number that was killing me. I asked not for charity, but for a loan, a chance to keep my boy breathing. Richard leaned back, his face impassive, swirling the ice in his glass of scotch. He said 4 words that still echo in my nightmares. Amanda, be realistic. I remember staring at him thinking I had misheard. Realistic. As if asking for a chance to keep Ethan alive was a fantasy. My mother sat beside him silent, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as though my desperation was an inconvenience she wanted to hurry through. They would not touch their retirement, Richard said. They would not risk their comfort for a gamble. They watched me cry on their expensive rug, watched me wipe snot and tears with my sleeve, and they felt nothing. My stepfather looked at me the way a banker might look at a failed client, another bad investment. I stumbled out of that house into the rain, soaked, shaking, trying to understand how family could choose comfort over life. In the days that followed, I lived on the edge of hope and terror, whispering to Ethan as he lay in his hospital bed that Mommy was trying, that Mommy was fighting, that we just needed a miracle. And then one afternoon, I saw the invoices my parents approved. They had committed to spending $230,000 on my sister Sophia's wedding at the Cincinnati Art Museum. $230,000 for flowers, for string quartets, for champagne that would flow for a single night while my son gasped for breath. My knees buckled under the weight of that betrayal. How could anyone justify spending nearly 3 times what my son's surgery required just to watch guests dance and drink and smile under chandeliers? I pressed my forehead against the hospital wall and sobbed until I tasted salt and metal. At night, I sat awake listening to the whir of machines, watching Ethan's chest rise and fall, terrified of the moment it would stop. I hated myself for being powerless. I hated Richard for turning his back on us. I hated my mother for letting him. My anger twisted into something sharp, something that cut me from the inside. Still, I clung to the hope that maybe they would change their minds. Maybe seeing Ethan pale and tethered to tubes would melt the ice around their hearts. One morning I asked them again. Richard's jaw tightened. He shook his head, repeating those words. Be realistic. My mother glanced away ashamed, or perhaps just tired of my voice. I walked out of that room with a fury I cannot describe, a fury that wrapped around my grief like barbed wire. In that moment, something broke inside me. I understood that Ethan's life did not matter to them as much as Sophia's party. I understood that my pleas were wasted breath. I understood that family could look you in the eye while your child fought for air and still choose roses and champagne over a heartbeat, and I promised myself that I would never forget. I promised myself that one day they would feel the weight of that choice. The day Ethan's heart stopped mine, shattered. I held his hand until it slipped from mine, until the beeping slowed and then went flat. I pressed my face into his chest and screamed silently because no sound I could make was enough. While I buried my son, my stepfather danced at my sister's wedding in a tuxedo that cost more than Ethan's hospital bills. While Sophia twirled under chandeliers, I lowered my boy into the ground. That is where this story begins. If you have ever felt powerless against the cruelty of your own family, like no one stood beside you when you needed them most, hit like right now, so I know I am not alone. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in a small house on the east side near Huffman Avenue. When I was 10 years old, my life cracked in two. My father, Daniel Harris, died in a trucking accident on I-70 not far from Springfield. The police report said he fell asleep at the wheel, but all I remember was standing beside my mother Linda at the funeral, holding her trembling hand as strangers whispered about how young he had been. He was 36. I was just a girl clutching the hem of my black dress and wondering why everyone kept patting my head as if that would bring my dad back. For a while, it was just me and Mom. We had almost nothing, but she tried to keep things together. She worked as a secretary, and I tried to keep my grades up. Those months after Dad's death, she seemed softer with me. She let me crawl into her bed when the nightmares woke me, and she promised me things would be okay. But then Richard appeared. Richard came into our lives about a year after my father's death. He was a financial manager from Dayton, well-dressed, charming in the beginning. He had a way of talking that made my mother's eyes light up as if he carried security and order in his voice. He drove a black Buick and always had the smell of cologne and cigarettes about him. To me, he seemed like an intruder. To my mother, he was stability. They married quickly, less than a year after meeting, and I was forced to move from our tiny rental into Richard's larger house in a suburban neighborhood. On the surface, it should have been a blessing. I had my own room, new clothes, and even a backyard, but the air inside that house was different. It belonged to him, and I knew from the first night that he expected everyone inside to remember it. Richard set rules for everything. Shoes had to be lined up in the entryway at a perfect angle. Dinner had to be on the table by 6. No television before homework. No talking back. At first, I thought these were normal adjustments the way families changed with a new parent. But soon, the rules became a cage. He commented on everything I did. If my grades slipped from an A to a B, he would take away privileges. If I forgot to make my bed, I would lose dinner. He believed punishment taught discipline, and he liked to deliver those lessons with a cold face and a sharp word. Sometimes his hand followed. When I was 14, I remember running late from school because I had stayed to work on a science project. By the time I got home, the streetlights were flickering on. Richard was waiting in the driveway, his Buick parked neatly, his arms crossed. He asked me once why I was late. I explained about the project about the teacher who kept us behind. He didn't like excuses. His hand came down hard across my face in full view of 2 neighborhood boys riding their bikes. The sting of his palm was sharp, but the shame was worse. I wanted the ground to open and swallow me whole. He grabbed my arm, dragged me inside, and told me never to embarrass him again. That night, I stared into the mirror at the faint red mark on my cheek and promised myself that one day I would leave. But promises made at 14 are not easy to keep. My mother stayed silent. She told me he was strict, that he cared about discipline, that I should learn to respect authority. Deep down, I think she was afraid of losing the financial security Richard provided. He covered the mortgage, he handled the bills, he made sure she didn't have to struggle the way she did when my father died. So she let him treat me like a soldier in his private army. The irony is that Richard was never violent with his own daughter Sophia. She was born when I was 12, and from the start, she was his princess. He spoiled her with attention gifts and soft words I never received. When she cried, he comforted her. When I cried, he told me to toughen up. The divide grew year after year until it felt like we weren't even raised in the same family. By the time I turned 18, the house no longer felt like home. It felt like a place I endured. I kept my head down, buried myself in books, and applied to Ohio State University in Columbus. When I received my acceptance letter, I didn't even tell Richard. I told my mother, and she smiled nervously, but she didn't celebrate. Richard was the one with the final say in our household, and her silence was her way of obeying him. I left anyway. I packed my bags, hugged her quickly, and walked out that door with no plans to return. I thought leaving Richard behind would mean leaving his control behind too. But I didn't know then how much his voice would echo through the rest of my life, how much his shadow would stretch into the years ahead. When I arrived in Columbus at 18, I thought I had broken free. Ohio State was only an hour away from Dayton, but it felt like another planet. For the first time, I didn't have Richard standing in the doorway, timing my arrival, didn't have to line up shoes or listen to lectures about discipline. I breathed differently. I studied education, spending long nights in the library, convinced that if I buried myself in work, I could build a future untouched by the rules of my childhood. But freedom was not as simple as distance. Richard's voice followed me. It echoed in my head every time I made a mistake. If I overslept and missed a class, I could hear him calling me lazy. If I struggled with a test, I could hear him reminding me that failure had consequences. Even when I wasn't under his roof, he was there, an invisible warden shaping my decisions. By 21, I met a man named Brian who seemed at first like the opposite of Richard. He was fun, adventurous, always talking about road trips and concerts. He made me feel seen in a way I had craved for years. But when I got pregnant, the adventure ended. I gave birth to Ethan in the fall of 2013, just as the leaves in Columbus were turning gold. I was 22, holding my son in my arms, terrified and exhilarated. My mother came to visit, bringing Richard with her. He stood at the foot of my hospital bed, looking at Ethan as though he were inspecting a ledger. "Children are expensive," he said flatly before congratulating Brian. That was Richard. Never a soft word for me, just an observation designed to remind me of my limitations. 2 years later, Brian left. He said he couldn't handle having a sick child, couldn't bear the weight of hospitals and bills. Ethan had been diagnosed with a congenital heart defect when he was 3, and the stress shattered whatever fragile bond we had. I became a single mother overnight. Richard called once during that time. He didn't offer support. He offered advice. "You should have chosen better," he told me. "You made your bed." I remember sitting on the floor of my small apartment, Ethan asleep in his crib, clutching the phone and thinking that Richard was right about one thing. I had made my bed, but unlike him, I would lie in it with my child. I would not walk away. Those years were hard. I worked full-time as a middle school science teacher, grading papers after Ethan fell asleep pinching pennies so I could afford his medications. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment in Columbus, nothing fancy, but it was ours. Sometimes my mother visited, bringing Sophia along. Sophia was in college, then glowing with the easy privilege Richard had given her. She talked about her internships, her trips, her new clothes, all paid for without hesitation. Richard paid her tuition in full. When she graduated, he bought her a car. I watched from a distance, smiling tightly while Ethan played with blocks on the floor. It was a familiar pattern, one I had known since childhood. I was the one who made do, who scraped by, who carried the heavy loads, while Sophia was lifted and celebrated. I told myself it didn't matter. What mattered was Ethan. Still, Richard's shadow stretched over me. When Ethan was 6, he needed his second surgery. Richard and Linda contributed part of the cost, but Richard made sure to remind me that it was not charity. "Think of it as an investment," he said when I don't expect to see much return on. That sentence burned. To him, my son's life was a ledger line, not a heartbeat. Even when he helped, it was laced with contempt. I began keeping track then. Not just bills and medical forms, but words. I wrote down the things he said, the way he treated me, the contrast in how he treated Sophia. At first, it was a way to process my anger. Later, it became something else. A record, a ledger of my own. By the time Ethan turned 7, I realized something chilling. Richard might not live under my roof anymore, but he still dictated the terms of my life. He was in every refusal, every sacrifice, every tear I shed quietly after Ethan went to sleep. His control had simply taken a new form, and it was in that recognition that the seed of defiance began to grow. By the summer of 2021, Ethan was 8 years old, and every breath he took sounded like a clock ticking down. The doctors at Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus had done everything they could with standard treatments. Morrison, a man with gray hair and tired eyes who had been with us from the start, pulled me aside one late afternoon. His office smelled faintly of coffee and antiseptic, the blinds casting sharp stripes of light across his desk. He folded his hands and looked at me in a way that made my stomach sink before he even spoke. "Amanda," he said, "the conventional surgeries are no longer enough. Ethan's heart is failing faster than expected. There is an experimental treatment, an advanced surgical procedure combined with a new drug therapy, but it comes at a cost, roughly $80,000. 80,000. The number carved itself into my brain, heavy and impossible. My teacher's salary barely covered rent utilities and the endless trickle of medical bills that arrived in white envelopes like ghosts. I had no savings, no safety net. I nodded slowly, swallowing the lump in my throat. How long does he have if we don't do it, Dr. Morrison's pause was mercifully brief but long enough to hurt. 6 months at most. Perhaps less. I walked back to Ethan's room, the fluorescent lights buzzing above me like angry bees. He was sitting up in bed, coloring in a dinosaur picture book, his oxygen tube slipping against his cheek. He looked up at me and grinned, unaware of the storm I carried in my chest. I kissed the top of his hair, inhaling the scent of shampoo and hospital plastic, and promised myself I would find a way. For weeks, I tried everything. I sold my few valuables, my grandmother's ring, the television, even the small car that got me to school each morning. I took buses across town and counted quarters at the grocery store. I started a GoFundMe and wrote until my fingers cramped begging strangers for help. Friends and colleagues gave what they could. Some parents of my students contributed. I raised $12,000 in 2 weeks. It felt like bailing water from a sinking ship with a teacup. I called organizations, charities, foundations. Each time, the answer was polite regret. The waiting lists were too long, the qualifications too strict. I lay awake, night after night, the hum of the oxygen machine in the next room, a reminder of my race against time. Finally, I turned back to the people I dreaded asking most. My mother and Richard lived just 20 minutes away in Upper Arlington in the same pristine house that had felt like a prison when I was a child. Their manicured lawn looked like a magazine cover, while my son's chest rose and fell under plastic tubes. I rehearsed what I would say on the drive there, how I would keep my voice steady, how I would appeal to their humanity. I told myself they would understand. They had to. I knocked on their door one July afternoon. Richard opened it wearing a pressed shirt and holding a glass of iced tea. His face was stern-lined deeper now with age, but the expression was the same one I had grown up with. Behind him, my mother hovered, her eyes already full of reluctance. Amanda Richard said flatly, "This isn't a good time. It has to be," I said. My voice wavered, but I forced it steady. "It's about Ethan." They let me in. The house smelled of lemon polish and freshly cut flowers, so different from the sterile scent of the hospital that clung to my clothes. I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I had once been lectured for hours about respect and discipline. I laid the medical documents out like evidence. "He needs a new treatment," I said. "It costs $80,000. I've raised 12. I'll do anything, take a second job, pay you back every cent with interest if you want. Please." He doesn't have time. Richard leaned back, arms crossed, and studied me the way he used to study balance sheets. My mother touched his arm lightly, but her lips pressed into that thin, disapproving line I knew too well. Amanda Richard said, his tone like stone, "We don't have that kind of money lying around." "You need to be realistic." The words hit me like a slap. I glanced toward my mother, desperate for softness, for compassion. "You paid for surgeries before I whispered." "I know it's a lot, but this is his life." My mother sighed, her eyes flickering toward Richard for permission before she spoke. "Honey, we've already helped you so much over the years. We can't just empty our retirement accounts. We're not getting any younger. I'm not asking for a gift," I said quickly. "I'm asking for a loan. I will pay you back. I promise. Please, Mom. Please, Richard. He's just a boy. He's your grandson." Richard shook his head slowly. "You're barely keeping your head above water now." "How would you pay us back?" "Be sensible. There are financing options. Hospitals have payment plans." "I've tried them," I said, my voice cracking. "They take too long. He doesn't have years. He has months." Silence filled the room, broken only by the faint clink of ice in Richard's glass as he took a deliberate sip. My mother looked away, her eyes shining with something like guilt, but she didn't speak. At last, Richard said, "We can't do it. I'm sorry. We have to think about our own future, too." I gathered the papers with shaking hands. "Your future," I repeated softly. "What about his—" They didn't answer. They didn't have to. I drove back to my apartment that night, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. Through the thin walls, the hiss of Ethan's oxygen machine was the only lullaby. I sat by his bed, listening to his uneven breaths, tears sliding silently down my face. I wanted to scream, to pound my fists against the walls, but instead I just held his hand. He stirred half asleep and whispered, "Mommy, it's okay. Don't cry." His small voice carried a strength I didn't have. I kissed his forehead and lied to him. "It's going to be okay." But deep inside, the truth settled like a stone. His grandparents had sealed his fate, and I would never forgive them. In the weeks after my parents turned me away, I carried their refusal like a bruise. I went back to the hospital each night, sat beside Ethan's bed, and tried to pretend hope still lived inside me. But the truth was that every day felt like a countdown, every beep of the monitor, a reminder of the time slipping through my fingers. And then, as if to mock me, news of my sister Sophia's wedding began to flood every conversation. She was 26, still living in Dayton, working in marketing for a firm Richard had helped her get into. She had always been the golden child, and now she was about to marry Jeffrey, a man from Cincinnati, whose family owned property and carried the kind of pedigree Richard worshipped. From the moment she announced the engagement, my parents' world became consumed with the wedding. My mother's voice turned syrupy on the phone as she gushed about floral arrangements, designer dress fittings, and menu tastings. Richard bragged about how nothing was too good for his youngest daughter. "It's her special day," he told me once, with the same cold tone he had used to deny Ethan's treatment. "Every bride deserves perfection." Perfection. I thought about that word as I stood in line at the pharmacy paying for Ethan's medication with crumpled bills. I thought about it as I pawned the last piece of jewelry I owned my grandmother's ring for a fraction of its worth. Perfection cost them $230,000. My son's life had been priced at $80,000. The wedding planning became impossible to ignore. Every family gathering revolved around it. My mother described touring venues, her eyes lighting up as she mentioned the Cincinnati Art Museum, where they eventually booked the ceremony and reception. The price tag, $80,000, the exact number that might have saved Ethan. I remember sitting there in her living room, listening, nodding politely while Ethan wheezed beside me, too tired to even play with his toys. The contrast was like a knife twisting deeper with every word. The dress alone was $12,000. Sophia posed in it for pictures that my mother proudly showed me on her phone. Lace and satin imported from Italy while I was scraping together money to buy Ethan a new nebulizer. The flowers were $15,000, orchids and roses in arrangements that would wilt within hours. That same amount could have covered nearly 3 months of Ethan's oxygen treatments. The catering was $40,000. Fine wines, 5 courses chefs flown in from Chicago. Meanwhile, Ethan's diet was restricted to bland, doctor-approved meals I learned to cook on a budget of $20 a week. Even Sophia's bachelorette party became a headline in our family. They flew 12 of her closest friends to Napa Valley for a weekend. A villa spa treatments, wine tastings. $10,000 gone in a blur of laughter and champagne. When my mother called to tell me about it, she said it was magical, Amanda. You should have seen her face. I hung up the phone and walked into Ethan's room where he lay hooked to his machines, his chest rising and falling with effort. Magical. That was the word my mother chose for Sophia's joy while I was watching my son fade away. Every detail of the wedding became a reminder. Invitations printed on thick cardstock with gold embossing $50 apiece arrived at my apartment. They felt like insults slipped under my door. The rehearsal dinner menu included lobster and steak. The wedding cake alone cost $5,000. I knew these numbers because my mother bragged about them, proud of the extravagance, as if money could buy meaning. What she didn't realize was that I was keeping track. Every cost, every receipt, every casual mention. I wrote them all down in a notebook next to Ethan's mounting medical bills. 2 columns of numbers, one filled with desperation, the other with indulgence. I didn't know what I would do with it yet, but I knew it mattered. One night, while Ethan was dozing beside me, I opened that notebook and stared at the parallel lists. My hand trembled as I wrote at the top what they chose. I underlined it twice. Sophia herself called me once during this time. Her voice was bubbling with excitement. Jeffrey and I are so blessed, she said. Mom and Dad are amazing. They told us there's no budget limit. Can you believe it? No budget limit. I tightened my grip on the phone. That's wonderful, Sophia. You'll be a bridesmaid, right? The dresses are only $300. I'll send you the link. $300, nearly 2 weeks of Ethan's medications. I'll think about it, I said quietly. She sighed, clearly annoyed. Amanda, this is supposed to be the happiest time of my life. Try to be supportive for once. Supportive. As if my lack of enthusiasm was the problem, not the fact that her joy was being built on the bones of my despair. After we hung up, I sat in the dark and cried. It wasn't just the money. It was the blindness, the willful refusal to see the reality in front of them. My son was dying, and they were worried about bridesmaid dresses and seating charts. Ethan's condition worsened in the fall. He spent more days in the hospital than out of it. His skin grew pale, his energy drained. He stopped asking when he could go back to school, stopped talking about being a scientist when he grew up. I could see the light dimming in him, and every time I heard my mother chatter about cake flavors, a piece of me died too. One evening in October, I came home from teaching summer school and found Ethan gasping for air, his lips tinged blue. I rushed him to the hospital, heart pounding. The doctor stabilized him, but Dr. Morrison shook his head when he saw me. Amanda, he said gently, we may have less time than we thought. 3 months had shrunk to weeks, maybe days. I sat by Ethan's bed that night, his hand curled around mine, and listened to the machines keeping him alive. I thought about the venue deposit Richard had proudly paid, about the floral arrangements, about the tuxedo fittings. I thought about what it meant to be a father or a stepfather. Richard had chosen what mattered to him, and it wasn't Ethan. It never had been. The night before Sophia's wedding, I stayed awake in the hospital room watching Ethan sleep. My phone buzzed with texts from my mother reminding me of the rehearsal dinner. I ignored them. At dawn, I looked at my son, pale and fragile, and whispered, I'm sorry. I tried. I really tried. His breathing hitched, and I clutched his hand tighter as if I could tether him to this world by sheer will. The next morning, while my parents adjusted centerpieces and checked seating charts, I signed palliative care paperwork. The contrast could not have been sharper. One child celebrated with champagne, the other slipping quietly toward death. In those days, I learned something I would never forget. Family can choose their priorities, and sometimes they will choose roses and lace over blood and breath. October came colder than usual that year. The air in Columbus felt heavy sharp against my lungs each morning as I walked into Nationwide Children's Hospital. Ethan had been in and out for weeks, his body weaker every day, his smile fading. I tried to keep things light for him, reading stories, bringing coloring books, holding his hand while cartoons played on the small TV. But behind my smile was terror. On the morning of October 19th, 2021, I knew something had shifted. Ethan's skin was gray, his breathing shallow, even with the oxygen set high. The monitors beeped erratically, nurses rushing in and out with tense faces. I stood at his side, gripping his small hand as though I could anchor him. His fingers were cool, his grip faint. Dr. Morrison came in his eyes, carrying the weight of bad news before he even spoke. Amanda, he said gently, I think it's time. I shook my head, not ready to hear it, not ready to accept the finality. But Ethan stirred, opened his eyes halfway, and whispered, Mommy, it's okay. Those 3 words shattered me. He was 8 years old, comforting me. As his body gave out, I felt the world tilt, felt myself fall into a silence so deep it drowned the sound of the machines. At 8:47 that morning, Ethan slipped away in his sleep, his tiny hand going limp in mine. I pressed my lips to his forehead, tears soaking his skin. A nurse touched my shoulder, but I couldn't move. The grief was a physical weight pressing me down until I couldn't breathe. I stayed with him for hours, unwilling to let go. The hospital staff gave me time, but eventually they needed to take his body. I left the room empty-handed, my arms aching with the absence. The world outside kept turning. Cars drove past, people walked down sidewalks, life moved forward, and I wanted to scream that mine had ended. That night, I sat in my apartment surrounded by Ethan's things, his dinosaur poster, his half-finished science kit, his stuffed bear still warm from his bed. I buried my face in his pillow and sobbed until I had no voice left. I expected my parents to come to at least sit beside me in my loss. Instead, I got a phone call. My mother's voice trembled when I told her. "Oh no, Amanda. Oh, Emily. What terrible timing." Timing. That was the word she chose. Not tragedy, not heartbreak. Timing because Ethan's funeral interfered with Sophia's wedding schedule. Something inside me cracked then, and though I didn't realize it in that moment, it was the beginning of the ice that would later keep me alive. The funeral was set for Friday, October 22nd. I didn't have money for anything elaborate. My principal lent me enough to cover the service, and a few of Ethan's teachers' parents pitched in to help. We held it at a small chapel in Columbus. 20 people came: my Aunt Teresa, a handful of teachers, a couple of neighbors. My parents arrived 45 minutes late, dressed as though they were heading to a gala. My mother dabbed her eyes delicately with a tissue. My father checked his watch twice. They stayed for the service, but left before the small reception at my apartment. "We really have to go." My father said the florist is expecting us at 11. The florist. Flowers for Sophia's centerpieces chosen with more urgency than saying goodbye to their grandson. They didn't even try to hide their priorities. I stood outside after they left, the cold October wind cutting against my face, and felt the last trace of warmth toward them die. 3 days later, Sophia's wedding unfolded in Cincinnati like nothing had happened. Photos circulated through family group texts, golden hour shots of the museum, Sophia in her $12,000 gown, the champagne tower glistening under chandeliers. My mother even sent me one message. "Wish you were here to share this special day. Sophia looks stunning." Stunning. 2 days after burying my son, I was expected to admire the sparkle of a wedding dress. I stared at the message until my vision blurred, then set the phone face down. I walked to the cemetery instead. The grass was still uneven over Ethan's grave. I couldn't afford a proper headstone yet. I sat on the ground, knees pressed into the dirt, and whispered, "You mattered. Even if they pretend you didn't, you mattered." As Sophia danced in her gown, I was kneeling in the cold, my hand on fresh earth. That weekend, the contrast seared itself into me permanently. Ethan was gone, but in a grotesque way, my parents and sister gave me a gift without realizing it. They made their choice so clear, so undeniable, that I never had to question it again. I buried my son, but I also buried the last fragile hope that my family would ever love me the way I needed. For weeks after, I drifted in a haze. I woke up each morning expecting to hear Ethan's cough, the hum of his oxygen machine, the shuffle of his feet. Instead, there was silence. I walked into his room daily, unwilling to box up his belongings, breathing in his scent until it faded. I returned to work too soon, moving like a ghost through the hallways of my school, my students looking at me with wide eyes as if they could sense the fracture in me. People said I was strong. They used that word often, as if endurance was a compliment. But I didn't feel strong. I felt hollow, scraped out from the inside. I was living, but only in the most technical sense. And yet, in that emptiness, something hard began to form. A seed planted during years of Richard's control, watered by Sophia's privilege, and now fertilized by loss. I didn't know what shape it would take yet, but I knew one thing with certainty. I would not forget. I would not forgive. I would remember every word, every dollar spent, every choice they made. And one day I would make them face it. The months after Ethan's funeral blurred together into a kind of gray fog. I would wake each morning to silence so heavy it pressed against my chest, and I would lie there staring at the ceiling, half expecting to hear the whir of his oxygen machine or the soft call of Mommy from his room. But there was nothing, just emptiness. My apartment felt like a museum of grief, every corner filled with remnants of Ethan, his dinosaur poster curling at the edges, the small pile of rocks he had collected from the park, the unopened science kit I had bought him for Christmas. I couldn't bring myself to pack them away. For a while, I existed in that space between life and death, going through motions without feeling them. Bills piled up, and the debts suffocated me. Hospitals sent statement after statement, each one a reminder of what I owed for treatments that had only delayed the inevitable. I maxed out credit cards, took payday loans, and juggled due dates until there was nothing left to shuffle. By spring of 2022, I had no choice but to declare bankruptcy under Chapter 7. It wiped away much of the medical debt, but it also annihilated my credit. Signing those papers felt like admitting defeat, like Ethan's death had stripped me of everything: my child, my finances, my dignity. I moved into a cheaper apartment in Eastmoor, a run-down one-bedroom with peeling paint and noisy neighbors. The walls were thin, the heating unreliable, but it was all I could afford. I worked during the day at the middle school, and in the evenings I tutored students for extra cash. Some nights I came home so tired I collapsed on the couch, fully dressed, waking only when the sun rose again. People called me strong, as if surviving loss was strength. But the truth was I wasn't living. I was enduring. Still, endurance has a way of hardening you. Somewhere in that endless grind, I began to rebuild, not quickly, not dramatically, but brick by brick. In late 2022, I enrolled in evening classes at Ohio State, again this time for a master's in educational administration. I would grade papers during the day, rush home for a quick dinner of ramen or canned soup, then sit in front of my laptop until midnight, typing essays and reading case studies. It wasn't easy. Some nights I cried from exhaustion, my hands trembling as I typed. But each credit I earned felt like a step forward, a small victory against the abyss. My principal, Mrs. Carter, noticed. She stopped me in the hall one afternoon, her eyes kind. "Amanda, I've watched you these past months. You're remarkable. Don't give up." Her words didn't erase my pain, but they gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time: belief. In 2023, I was promoted to assistant principal at my school. The pay increase was modest, but it gave me breathing room. For the first time since Ethan's diagnosis, I wasn't drowning. I started saving, not much at first, just small amounts tucked away in a separate account. I didn't know exactly why I was saving, but I knew I wanted resources if the day ever came when I needed them. I lived simply. No vacations, no luxuries, just work, school, and sleep. People might have called it lonely, but for me, it was survival. At night, when the silence became too much, I opened my notebook, the one I had started during Ethan's illness. In it were the numbers, the receipts, the costs of Sophia's wedding lined up against Ethan's medical bills. But over time, I added more. Every comment Richard had made, every slight, every family gathering where my parents bragged about Sophia while ignoring Ethan, every social media post my mother wrote calling Sophia's children her first grandchildren. I kept it all. It wasn't obsession. It was record-keeping. Evidence. Proof that I hadn't imagined the cruelty. Proof that someday, when the time was right, the truth would have weight. In 2024, I finished my master's degree. I walked across that stage alone, no family in the audience. But when I held that diploma in my hands, I felt Ethan with me. I whispered, "We did it, buddy," because in a way, it was his victory too. Soon after, I was offered the position of principal at a local middle school in Columbus. My salary finally allowed me stability. I moved into a slightly better apartment, still modest, but warm and safe. I bought myself a reliable used car, and my savings grew. By early 2025, I had over $100,000 tucked away money, built from sacrifice tutoring, frugal living, and relentless focus. My life looked respectable from the outside, but inside, I was still carrying that ice. I saw my parents and Sophia occasionally, mostly at obligatory family events. Each time, the contrast between our worlds was jarring. Sophia had 2 children now, and her husband, Jeffrey, had risen to vice president at his firm. They posted pictures from vacations in Italy and summers in Cape Cod. My parents beamed in every photo, holding Sophia's children as if Ethan had never existed. At one point, a distant cousin commented on a Facebook post, "Your first grandchild is so beautiful." My mother replied, "Yes, we are so blessed." No correction. No mention of Ethan. It was as though my son had been erased from their history, scrubbed away like an inconvenience. I screenshotted the post and added it to my collection. I told myself I wasn't bitter, just careful. But the truth is, bitterness became my shield. It kept me upright when grief threatened to collapse me. And slowly, carefully, I transformed bitterness into resolve. By the spring of 2025, 4 years after Ethan's death, I stood taller. I wasn't healed. I don't think you ever heal from burying a child, but I was no longer broken. I was rebuilt stronger, harder, sharper. I had become a woman Richard couldn't control. A woman Sophia couldn't overshadow a woman my mother could no longer dismiss. I didn't know it yet, but their world was about to collapse. And when they came to me begging for help, I would finally have the power they once denied me. By early 2025, whispers of Richard's downfall began to reach me. At first, it was just murmurs at family gatherings or through distant relatives. The firm is under investigation. Something about mismanagement. Richard may be retiring sooner than expected. I paid little attention. For most of my life, Richard had seemed untouchable. The man who held the purse strings, the one whose word carried final authority in every room. But by March, the whispers hardened into facts. His company based out of Dayton had been implicated in a financial scandal involving misreported assets. Richard wasn't the mastermind, but he was high enough in the hierarchy to be stained by the fallout. They quietly pushed him out, and suddenly he no longer had a title to boast about. He was a 63-year-old man without a salary, clinging to the remnants of a reputation that no longer mattered. My mother's calls grew more frequent. Her voice, once clipped and self-assured, carried a tremor. "We're fine," she insisted each time, as if saying it enough would make it true. But then she mentioned their health insurance running out the mortgage company, calling the savings dwindling faster than they had expected. Their suburban house in Upper Arlington, with its perfect lawn and freshly painted shutters, suddenly looked less like a fortress and more like a liability. Meanwhile, Sophia's picture-perfect life began to crack as well. Jeffrey's promotion came with relocations, and his hours were long. Sophia was overwhelmed with 2 toddlers' bills piling up despite the facade of perfection she tried to maintain online. My parents, once eager babysitters, now begged off, citing stress and doctor's appointments. The golden family image was tarnishing piece by piece. I didn't gloat, not yet. I watched silently, as if observing a storm from behind glass. In April, the call came that shifted everything. It was a rainy Thursday, thunder rumbling low over Columbus when I heard the knock on my door. I opened it to find Richard standing there, his once polished frame slightly slumped, his suit damp and wrinkled from the weather. For the first time in my life, he looked small. My mother hovered behind him, her umbrella useless against the downpour, her hair plastered to her forehead. "Amanda," Richard said, his voice slower. "We need to talk." I let them in, saying nothing, leading them to the kitchen table, the same kind of table where he had once lectured me for hours, where he had dismissed my pleas for Ethan. Now it was my turn to sit at the head, while he shifted uncomfortably in the chair opposite me. My mother clutched her handbag like a lifeline. Richard cleared his throat. "We're in a difficult situation. The house, we're at risk of losing it. Medical costs, mortgage, everything, it's piling up. We need help." I watched him carefully, every syllable sinking in like the sweetest poison. He had spent decades teaching me that weakness was shameful, that asking for help was failure. Now he was here, doing the very thing he had condemned in me. I kept my voice even. "What exactly are you asking?" His jaw tightened. He didn't like saying the words. "A loan," he admitted finally. 90,000 would cover the mortgage and keep things steady while we regroup. You've done well for yourself. You must have savings." My mother jumped in quickly, her voice pleading. "Amanda, you're the only one we can turn to. Sophia has her own hands full, and well, you're stable. We know this is a lot, but we'll pay you back as soon as we can." Stable. That was the word she chose, as if my stability had not been built from the ashes of the life they had refused to save. I folded my hands on the table, leaning forward slightly. "Interesting," I said softly. "I remember begging for a loan once. 80,000. Do you recall that, Richard?" His face flinched, the mask cracking for a moment. My mother shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting away. "Amanda, this isn't the same thing." "It's exactly the same thing," I cut in, my voice sharper now. "Only difference is your loan would save a house. Mine would have saved a child." The silence that followed was heavy, the only sound the rain tapping against the window. Richard stared at me, his lips pressed tight, his pride choking him. My mother reached across the table, her hand trembling. "Please," she whispered, "we're desperate." For a flicker of a second, I saw the younger version of myself reflected in her, the girl who had begged for compassion and been denied. But this time, I wasn't that girl. I was the woman who had buried her son alone while they danced at a wedding. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of the moment settle. I wanted them to feel it, to sit in the discomfort, to taste what they had made me taste. Finally, I said, I'll consider it. But if I help, it will be on my terms. Richard opened his mouth to argue, but I raised a hand. Not a word. You'll hear my terms when I'm ready to speak them. Until then, you wait. They nodded, subdued, their power drained. As they left my apartment huddled together under the umbrella, I stood at the window and watched. For the first time in my life, I saw them for what they were not, untouchable giants, not gatekeepers of everything I needed, but fragile, flawed people whose empire was crumbling. And for the first time, I realized the balance of power had shifted. They needed me now, and that truth was the beginning of my revenge. I chose the timing carefully. It was May 10th, 2025, a warm Saturday evening in Columbus. The sky outside my apartment was streaked with orange and pink, the air heavy with the scent of spring blooms. I had spent the entire day arranging documents, photographs, and receipts on my kitchen table like pieces on a chessboard. This wasn't going to be a simple talk. It was going to be a reckoning. When Richard and Linda arrived, they carried the same tension I had seen weeks before. Richard's suit was pressed, but his tie hung a little loose, as though even fabric had stopped respecting him. Linda clutched her purse like a shield, her eyes darting nervously around my modest apartment. "Thank you for seeing us," Richard said, his tone formal, clipped the kind of tone he used in boardrooms. "We appreciate it." I gestured toward the table. "Sit." They obeyed, hesitating as their eyes fell on the piles of paper spread across the wooden surface. Hospital bills, insurance denials, GoFundMe printouts, wedding invoices, receipts for floral arrangements, catering orders, Sophia's gown. Photos of Ethan in his hospital bed, oxygen mask strapped to his face. And beside them, photos of Sophia twirling in her dress, Richard smiling in a tuxedo, champagne flutes clinking. Two worlds side by side, impossible to ignore. I sat opposite them, my hands steady, though my pulse thundered in my ears. For years they had controlled the room, but tonight it was mine. "You came here asking for $90,000, I began calmly. "Before I make a decision, I want to hear something from you." Richard's jaw tightened. "Amanda!" "No," I cut in, my voice sharp. "Not a lecture, not excuses, just the truth. I want you to say it, out loud." Linda frowned, her brow furrowed. "Say what?" I leaned forward, eyes locked on hers. "Say what you chose. Say that when I begged you for $80,000 to save Ethan, you said no. And then you spent $230,000 on Sophia's wedding. Say it." My mother recoiled, her lips parting, but no words came. Richard cleared his throat, trying to recover authority. "Amanda, it's more complicated than that. You're oversimplifying." I slammed my palm down on the table, the sound sharp in the small kitchen. "No, it's not complicated. It's arithmetic. 80,000 for life, 230 for flowers and music. What did you choose?" The silence that followed was thick. Linda's hands trembled in her lap, her eyes wet. Richard's face flushed, his pride battling with the undeniable evidence spread before him. Finally, I reached for a photo Ethan in the hospital, his small face pale, his eyes half open, and placed it in front of Richard. "Look at him," I demanded. Richard glanced down, then quickly away. "Look at him." My voice cracked raw. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered his eyes. His lips pressed into a hard line. We made a mistake," he muttered. I leaned closer, refusing to let him wriggle out. "Not a mistake. A choice. Say the word. You chose." Linda's tears spilled, then her hands covering her mouth. "We chose," she whispered. "We chose the wedding." The words hung in the air like poison finally released. My chest tightened, but not with grief this time, with a cold, sharp satisfaction. "Thank you," I said softly. "That's all I wanted. The truth." Richard shifted uncomfortably, his pride bleeding into anger. "What good does this do? Digging up the past, throwing it in our faces. Ethan is gone. Nothing will bring him back. I held his gaze unflinching. No, nothing will bring him back. But you'll never erase what you did. You'll never rewrite this. And tonight you've admitted it to me to yourselves. You chose a party over a life. That's who you are. Linda sobbed into her hands. Richard clenched his fists, his knuckles white against the table. I let the silence stretch, let the weight of their admission sink deep. This was just the beginning. I let them sit in their own silence for a long time, both of them staring at the table littered with their choices. Linda's sobs had quieted to shallow breaths, and Richard's face was rigid, his jaw locked as though if he clenched any tighter, he might break his teeth. I wanted them to feel every second of that suffocating weight. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, almost gentle. You came here for $90,000. I can give it to you. Their heads snapped up. Relief flickered across Linda's face, the kind of relief that comes when drowning people see a rope tossed their way. Richard tried to mask it with his usual sternness, but his shoulders sagged with the tiniest crack of hope. I slid open a folder beside me and placed a check on the table. $90,000, my name signed at the bottom in careful, deliberate ink. I watched their eyes fix on it like starving animals staring at food. But I said, letting the word cut through the air, there are conditions. Richard stiffened. Conditions? Yes, I replied. If you take this check, you sign an agreement. From this moment forward, you cut off all contact with me. No calls, no visits, no requests for anything else. We will be done. Completely. Forever. Linda gasped, her hands clutching each other. Amanda, you don't mean that. I leaned forward, my eyes drilling into hers. I mean every word. I begged you once. I begged you to save my son's life, and you said no. Now you beg me, and I say yes, but on my terms. This money buys my silence, my distance, and my freedom. You want it, you sign. If not, you leave this apartment tonight with nothing. Richard's face flushed. You can't be serious. We're family. The word family sliced through me like glass, but I refused to flinch. Family shows up, I said, my voice sharp as steel. Family doesn't choose roses and champagne over blood and breath. Don't you dare call yourself my family. He tried to glare at me, but his power was gone. He looked across the table at Linda, whose tears streamed freely now. Amanda, please, she whispered. We've lost so much already. I picked up a pen, slid it across the table with the document I had prepared, simple notarized binding. It stated in plain language that accepting the money meant permanent severance. No claims, no obligations, no ties. All you have to do is sign, I said. Richard stared at it, his pride warring with his desperation. I could see the storm behind his eyes. He wanted to refuse to walk out with dignity, but dignity doesn't pay mortgages. Pride doesn't keep lights on. And Richard Harris was no longer a man with leverage. Slowly, with trembling fingers, he picked up the pen. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the paper, then scribbled his name with a sharp, angry stroke. Linda followed her signature shaky, her tears smudging the ink. When they slid the paper back to me, I tucked it neatly into my folder and pushed the check toward them. There, I said quietly, you got what you wanted, and I got what I needed. Richard snatched up the check, shoving it into his jacket pocket as though afraid I might change my mind. But I didn't. I sat still composed, watching as the last ties of obligation between us dissolved. As they stood to leave, Linda paused at the door, her face crumpling. Amanda, one day you'll regret this. I met her gaze with cold clarity. The only regret I have, I said, is ever believing you'd choose me. Or him. Her lips parted, but no words came. Richard opened the door, and together they walked into the night, carrying their check like a lifeline, leaving behind the daughter they had turned into an enemy. When the door shut, I sat back in my chair, the silence of my apartment wrapping around me. For the first time in years, I felt something like peace. Not joy, not healing, but peace. I had taken back the power they stole from me, and I knew deep down they would live the rest of their lives haunted by the truth they had spoken out loud. The night after Richard and Linda left my apartment, I sat at the same kitchen table where hours earlier they had signed their surrender. The document was tucked safely in a folder, the ink still fresh, and the silence of my apartment felt different now. For years, it had been the silence of grief, a hollow echo that reminded me of Ethan's absence. Tonight, it was the silence of control, of choice. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one begging. I was the one who decided. But the check I had given them wasn't the end. It was only the transaction. The real payoff, the one I had been building toward for 4 years, was still to come. I pulled out my notebook, the one I had filled with receipts and records dates and numbers, photos, and screenshots. I laid them out like puzzle pieces, and then I opened my laptop. Aunt Teresa in Cleveland had always been the voice in the family who refused to be silenced. She was my father's sister, sharp-tongued and unafraid of truth. She had been at Ethan's funeral sitting in the back pew, her eyes full of quiet rage as she watched Richard and Linda arrive late and leave early. I knew if anyone would help me, it was her. I drafted an email. At first, the words came shaky, but then they poured, each sentence sharper than the last. I attached scans of the wedding invoices, the hospital bills, the GoFundMe page with its pitiful $12,000 total. I attached screenshots of my mother calling Sophia's children her first grandchildren. I added photos, Ethan pale and fragile in his hospital bed, Sophia beaming in her $12,000 dress. At the end, I wrote, "They made a choice. They chose roses and champagne over Ethan's life. They chose Sophia's perfection over my son's survival. This is who they are. Share it if you will. The truth deserves light." I hesitated only once, my finger hovering over the send button. Then I clicked. Within 24 hours, Teresa replied with one word, "Done." The ripple began quietly. A cousin called me to ask if it was true. Then another messaged me on Facebook. Then the texts multiplied. By the end of the week, the truth wasn't a whisper, it was a storm. Teresa had forwarded my email to every relative, every friend in her address book. She shared it in her church circle, her book club, even on her Facebook page where she tagged Richard and Linda. "This is my family's truth," she wrote. "Decide for yourselves." The reaction was immediate and merciless. Family members who had once praised Richard's generosity now sent me private messages of horror. Old friends of my mother's stopped inviting her to luncheons. At their country club, Richard was quietly removed from committees. One former colleague even posted publicly, "I worked with Richard Harris for 10 years. I always suspected he was cold. Now I know." Sophia called me in fury. Her voice trembled as she hissed through the phone. "You ruined everything." Jeffrey's parents saw that email. His firm saw it. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I let her scream, let her rage, and then I spoke softly. "You should have thought of that before you took blood money for roses." And I hung up. The silence after was delicious. By June, the damage was complete. Richard and Linda stopped attending their church after whispers turned into stares. The pastor himself, once a family friend, asked them not to return until things settled down. They never did. At the country club where Richard had strutted for years, their membership was quietly revoked. Sophia and Jeffrey packed up and moved to Indiana, trying to escape the cloud that followed them, but gossip travels faster than moving vans. I didn't dance in their ruin, but I didn't hide from it either. I went on with my life. I walked into my school each morning, greeted my staff, and kept my dignity intact. When parents shook my hand, when students waved at me in the hallways, I carried myself with quiet pride. They would never know the storm I had unleashed, and that was fine. My power wasn't in screaming. It was in truth, documented and undeniable. One evening, months later, I saw Linda outside a grocery store. She looked smaller, her once polished hair now gray at the roots, her clothes plainer than I'd ever seen. She spotted me, froze, then turned away quickly as if I were a ghost. For a moment, I almost called after her. Almost. But I didn't. She had made her choice years ago. Now she was living with it. Back home, I opened Ethan's box, the one I kept under my bed. Inside were his drawings, his favorite toy dinosaur, the small journal I had written in during his final months. I touched the pages, the ink smudged by old tears, and whispered, "It's done, Ethan. They can never hurt us again." The payoff wasn't about money. It wasn't about revenge in the way Richard would have understood it. It was about exposing the truth so loudly, so publicly, that they could never bury it again. Their legacy was no longer one of control and prestige. It was one of cruelty, selfishness, and shame. And every time they walked into a room, they would carry that shadow with them. For years, I had been the powerless one, the woman begging for scraps, the girl silenced at the kitchen table. Now, I was the one who had written the final word in their story. And the beauty of it was this: I hadn't lifted a fist. I hadn't screamed in anger. I had simply told the truth. And the truth was enough to dismantle the empire they had built. The fallout did not fade. It deepened with time. By the end of summer 2025, the once pristine Harris family name had become a quiet scandal, whispered in pews, whispered at golf courses, whispered behind closed doors in the very neighborhoods they had once ruled. Richard tried to carry himself with the old pride, but the world no longer bowed to him. Former colleagues avoided him at the grocery store. Men who had once clapped him on the back at the country club now looked through him like glass. He found piecemeal consulting work, the kind of jobs that paid enough to keep the lights on, but never enough to restore what he had lost. For a man who once measured worth by prestige, the humiliation was worse than poverty. I heard from Teresa that he now spent hours alone in his garage, tinkering with broken tools, just to have something to fix. Linda fared no better. Once the picture of a polished suburban wife, she retreated into herself. She stopped attending church altogether after the pastor asked for space. Neighbors whispered that she was too ashamed to leave the house except for errands. The woman who had once scolded me for being too emotional now broke down in parking lots, her tears public, her mascara streaking. I saw her once at a pharmacy, her cart filled with discount items, her back hunched. She avoided my eyes, clutching her purse like a lifeline. For a fleeting second, I almost felt pity. Then I remembered Ethan's face, the way she had turned from him to fix flowers for Sophia's wedding, and the pity turned to stone. Sophia and Jeffrey left Ohio, moving across state lines to Indiana, but distance does not erase truth. The email Teresa had circulated followed them like a shadow. Jeffrey's firm bristled at the association, and Sophia's attempts to integrate into her new community faltered. Other mothers at the playground whispered, their eyes sliding away when she approached. Her children became collateral in a war she had never imagined, losing their playdates canceled, their invitations retracted. Sophia wrote me once a long, rambling email filled with accusations and self-pity. "You destroyed my family," she wrote. "You ruined my life just because you couldn't let go of your bitterness." I stared at the words for a long time before replying with a single sentence: "I didn't ruin anything. You did the day you let them choose your wedding over my son's life." She never wrote again. For me, the silence became different, lighter, freer. My apartment no longer felt haunted. I began to reclaim space piece by piece. I packed Ethan's toys carefully into a chest, not to erase him, but to protect him. I framed one of his dinosaur drawings and hung it in my office at school. Parents noticed it sometimes, and I would smile and say, "My son drew that." It was my way of making sure he was never erased again. My work thrived. The school flourished under my leadership, and I was no longer just surviving day to day. I mentored younger teachers, spoke at local conferences, and even began a small scholarship fund in Ethan's name with the savings I had fought to build. Each year, one student with dreams of studying science would receive help in his memory. It was not the life I had envisioned, but it was purpose. People sometimes asked me if I regretted exposing my family so publicly. "Doesn't it feel harsh?" one colleague asked gently, her eyes cautious. I answered without hesitation. Harsh was begging for your child's life and being told no. Harsh was burying him while they danced at a wedding. The truth isn't harsh. The truth is necessary. There were nights when grief still found me, nights when I lay awake remembering Ethan's laugh, the way his small hand felt curled around mine. On those nights I would whisper to him as though he were just in the next room, "I did it, Ethan. They'll never hurt us again." And somehow, sleep would come easier. Richard and Linda's world shrank to the size of their shame. They lived in their house no longer manicured and pristine, its lawn overgrown, paint peeling. They avoided gatherings, avoided friends, avoided mirrors. Sophia faded into obscurity, her once perfect image fractured. The golden child had become a cautionary tale. And me, I walked with my head high. Not because I had won some petty war, but because I had told the truth and survived it. In the end, revenge did not look like shouting or breaking. It looked like peace. It looked like Richard Harris standing in line at the bank, no one greeting him. It looked like Linda Harris clutching her cart at the grocery store, eyes downcast. It looked like Sophia once adored, now ignored. It looked like me standing on a stage at a school assembly presenting a scholarship in Ethan's name while my community applauded. I didn't need their love anymore. I didn't need their approval. I had something stronger. My son's memory honored my dignity intact, and a future no longer chained to their cruelty. The consequences weren't just theirs. They were mine, too. But mine were healing, growth, and freedom. Theirs were lost shame and silence. And that, I realized, was the truest justice of all. The summer of 2025 carried a softness I hadn't felt in years. For the first time since Ethan's diagnosis, I could breathe without the weight of survival pressing against my chest. The storm with my family had passed, their world reduced to silence and shame, and mine expanded into something steadier, quieter, truer. Still, there was one journey I hadn't yet taken, one promise I had made long ago that remained unfulfilled. Years before, on one of Ethan's better days, he had been curled up on the couch with a book about America's national parks. His small finger had landed on a photo of Yellowstone, its geysers erupting into the sky. One day, Mommy, he had set his eyes wide. "We'll go there. I want to see the earth breathe fire." I had laughed and told him yes one day. That promise had haunted me ever since. Now, with my savings stable and my school on summer break, I packed a small bag, carried the urn containing Ethan's ashes, and boarded a plane west. Flying into Wyoming, the mountains rose like ancient guardians, their peaks sharp against the endless blue. The air smelled different, cleaner, almost sacred. I rented a car and drove through winding roads, pine trees crowding the horizon, elk grazing near the shoulders, as if they belonged more to this world than I ever had. My hands trembled on the wheel, not from fear, but from the gravity of what I was about to do. I checked into a modest lodge near the park, but I barely slept that night. At dawn, I rose and drove into Yellowstone. Steam rose from the ground in places, the earth alive beneath my feet, breathing in hisses and sighs. I carried Ethan with me close to my chest, my steps slow, reverent. When I reached the grand prismatic spring, the world seemed to open. Colors rippled across the water, blue, green, orange, gold, like a living painting. The air shimmered with heat, and the smell of sulfur hung thick. I stood there clutching the urn and felt the tears come. Not the hot tears of rage or the endless tears of grief, but something softer. Tears of release. I walked to a quiet overlook away from the clusters of tourists and opened the urn. For a moment, I hesitated, my fingers trembling on the lid. It felt impossible to let go, as though releasing the ashes meant losing him all over again. But then I remembered his voice, small and full of wonder. "I want to see the earth breathe fire." I tilted the urn, and the wind lifted Ethan's ashes into the air. They swirled like silver dust carried upward on the rising heat. For a fleeting second, it looked as though the earth itself had taken him, scattering him into its breath. I closed my eyes, inhaled deeply, and whispered, "We made it, Ethan. You're free." The weight that had lived in my chest for 4 years eased in that moment. Not gone, never gone, but lighter. The silence inside me changed again. Not grief, not anger, not even revenge. Peace. I stayed there for hours, watching the geysers spout the earth, hiss the sky shift from morning to noon. I thought about everything that had brought me here. Richard's control, my mother's complicity, Sophia's privilege, Ethan's suffering. For years, those things had defined me, shaping my days into survival and bitterness. But here, surrounded by earth older than any cruelty, I realized something. Their choices had shaped my pain, but they did not define my future. Justice hadn't come in a courtroom or a dramatic explosion. It had come in truth. In exposing them and watching their reputations crumble, in forcing them to live with the consequences of their own decisions. And more than that, justice had come in reclaiming my life, my strength, my son's memory. As the sun dipped lower, painting the horizon in gold, I opened my journal, the same one where I had tracked every receipt, every cruel choice, and for the last time, I wrote, Ethan Harris, beloved son, his life mattered, his truth lives. Then I closed the book and placed it in my backpack, knowing I might never open it again. That night back at the lodge, I sat by a fire pit as the stars unfolded above me. The Milky Way stretched across the sky, dazzling infinite. I thought about how small we are against time and space, how fleeting our days can be, and yet how deeply love roots itself in us. I didn't feel alone under that sky. I felt connected to Ethan, to the universe, to something larger than grief. When I returned to Ohio weeks later, I carried no ashes, no anger, no unfinished promises. My apartment was still modest, my life still simple, but everything had changed. I was no longer the woman who had begged and been denied. I was no longer the girl silenced at a kitchen table. I was Amanda Harris, mother, principal, survivor, truth teller. Sometimes people ask me what revenge looks like. I smile softly and tell them it isn't always fire and fury. Sometimes it's truth whispered so loudly it echoes for years. Sometimes it's choosing peace while those who wronged you live with shame. And sometimes it's standing on the edge of Yellowstone, scattering ashes into the sky and finally breathing free. So, if you're listening, if you've ever been broken by those who were supposed to love you, hear me, your time will come. And when it does, the truth will speak louder than any insult, any betrayal, any cruelty ever could.